Thank you. I'm delighted to welcome Honor Eldridge from Plantlife, and she's going to do a talk for us on grasslands as a climate solution. Now, Honor is the policy lead for Plantlife International. She specializes in agriculture and farming policy. Her area of focus includes both grasslands and climate, international agri-food trade policy, and agri-tech innovation. She's written briefings on grasslands as a climate solution, on potential food implications for a transatlantic trade deal, and on migrant labor in large-scale horticulture. In addition to her Plantlife role, she's the chair of GM Freeze. She's a board member of the Organic Research Centre and a participatory board member of Bristol Food Producers. She was previously head of policy for the Sustainable Food Trust, and she worked on post-Brexit policy at the Soil Association and was legislative and government affairs coordinator in Washington, DC for the Centre for Food Safety. So we've got a very qualified person here to talk to us about grasslands. But before we start that, just a couple of bits of etiquette for Zoom. We're going to switch to a slideshow to support Honor's presentation. So just as we do that, you may have a couple of moments where the screen goes blank, and we'll just test that the slide pack is working before we get started. If I can ask you all to check that you're on mute, I think you are from what I can see at the moment. But since we're likely to have quite a lot of people join us at some point during this, if you can keep yourselves on mute, it'll make it easier for everybody to hear. We're going to run through the presentation supported by the slides, and then we'll have an open question and answer session at the end. But if you're able to, if you're a techie person who's rather better than me at this, if you can put any questions or any thoughts that occur to you during the presentation in the chat, then that will be superb, and I can pick some of those up and help to stimulate the Q&A at the end of that session. And as we said earlier, we're going to record this, so if anybody's got any objections to recording, if they could shout out now, then we'll switch the recording off. Otherwise, we'll keep going with it. So no, I think we're okay there. Good. Honor, I'm going to hand over to you. And, welcome.
Great. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to be talking to all of you who've made time on your Wednesday morning. Hopefully it's worth it, and I'm interesting enough to justify the time away from everything else. So as Mike said, I have been working on promoting species-rich grasslands as a climate solution and highlighting their important role in being a biodiversity hotspot, and also providing a lot of the resilience that we need to build into our food systems and landscapes. So I have got a little presentation because I think it helps sometimes to draw people through. So if I start sharing my screen, I can go from there. Can everyone see that?
Yep, we're fine with that, Honor. That's good.
All right. So as Mike said, I work for Plantlife, and so it has a sort of Plantlife slant to it, but I've also got quite a lot of other hats, as was outlined in my bio. So a bit of that will bleed in, and I'm very happy to answer questions on the sort of wider impacts. So this is a species-rich grassland. They are beautiful and colourful and bright, and have really amazing diversity and complexity, supporting all different types of life, from the bumblebees and butterflies all the way through to barn and birds, and livestock, and ultimately us, all the meat eaters among us at least. But these are really precious habitats that we have across the UK. I'm down in the West Country, and I can tell you that we've certainly got the perfect climate for growing grass, and we have one of the most species-rich habitats across the UK within our grasslands. And I'm terribly sorry if there's some background noise. It seems like it's the rubbish collection time here, so you might have to put up with that. But what we can see with this is actually we're losing these incredibly rare grasslands. So since the 1930s, we've seen this massive decline in species richness, in the decline of the orange line, and rough grazing. And while the total area of grassland has declined as well, we've seen this increase of improved grasslands. And what we mean by improved grasslands is essentially monoculture ryegrass that has high levels of fertilizer applied to it in order to make it grow faster and quicker. And when you put on high levels of fertilizer, it changes the dynamics and the pH of the soil, meaning that actually a lot of these species that are designed to be designed to grow within nitrogen light environments are suddenly overwhelmed by the amount of nitrogen that is in the soil and around them, and so as a result they don't grow because they're outcompeted by these other grasses that do thrive in grasslands with high levels of nitrogen. So the other thing that is in the background of this, as you see that decline, is the expansion of development. So quite a lot of grasslands get lost to house building, and it's quite easy to see when an ancient woodland gets chopped down and they arrive with bulldozers and chainsaws, and you get your activists going out and sort of tying themselves to trees and kicking up a fuss. It's really difficult to see when some of these ancient grasslands get ripped up, because for most people it's quite challenging to see the difference between species-rich grassland and one of these improved grasslands. So it's not all bad news though. 1% still remain, and that means that we've got to work really hard to protect the species-rich grasslands that do remain, and also fight really hard to improve the funding and support for restoration so that we can bring back some of this diversity that we have in our agricultural systems. And so at Plantlife, we support the need to restore and species-rich grassland to be a nature-based solution and a sustainable future for agricultural land. And that's our mission statement, and that's what I've been working with Plantlife for the last 2 years to try and achieve. So I have a little video which hopefully will work. It's always a bit of a risk, but let's see. Here we go. So as you saw at the end, this was our primary call for COP26, And so at Plantlife, we launched the Grasslands Plus campaign in the summer to encourage the UK government to recognise the importance of grasslands within COP26 as a climate solution, and to start giving them the adequate recognition and support that they need in order to deliver as a nature-based solution going forward. So there we go. So here's another, beautiful photo of what we're talking about. And I think it is a point that the video makes really well, that we think of these as just being purely visual and pretty, but actually they've got incredible value to humanity and to the ecosystem and landscape. And that's really what we want to talk about, is what they do, what ecosystem services they provide and public goods they provide, that go far beyond just being a beautiful area to walk through. And so when we drill down, these are some of the rarest species within grasslands that we see, and you can see that they really support this wide variety of life. The bumblebees, the honeybees, the butterflies and farm birds, and all sorts of small mammals within them that provide this really thriving ecosystem that we have taken for granted rather too frequently. So here is a list of some of the grassland species that we have that are dependent on these habitats and are all under threat as a result of the development and loss of species-rich grasslands. And I know that you had Buglife come and speak about their beeline project. Well, you can't have beelines without species-rich grasslands within them, because that provides the nectar and the habitat and the home for a lot of these different types of bee and different types of butterfly. And so, but grasslands, while a lot of grasslands are just managed for haymaking, a lot of them are also managed for livestock. And there is a real difference and nuance within a livestock conversation about small, sustainable grazing systems where you have heritage breeds grazing on the right types of grasslands in order to improve the carbon cycling. But also this has a huge amount of animal welfare benefits. So one of the things that we're finding is that if you put cattle into a species-rich grassland, they'll go and find the right plant for them. And that not only helps with their nutritional benefits, so they have a much better meat and dairy that result from pasture-based grazing, has much higher levels of minerals and vitamins in them and a much better ratio of fatty acids. But they also, you can create what we call hospital fields, where you put sick animals into them and they actually naturally go and find the species that will help them and will provide the medicine that they need. And that at a time when we're seeing rising antimicrobial resistance is really important, because we can't just keep on using antibiotics to keep our livestock healthy when we have these other alternatives, like letting them feed naturally on these systems in order to improve their own health. And so a lot of farmers are really recognising this. They are switching over to more sustainable management systems. And as a result, they want to differentiate their livestock that's on species-rich grassland, from the more industrialised produce, meat and dairy, that don't have that natural system and are fed primarily on grain and on soy. And so one of them is the organic certification, has much more rigorous requirements as to what it is. But one of the best is the Pasture for Life certification, which a number of farmers across the UK and increasingly internationally are looking at, where they really look at the pasture that these cattle are being grazed on, and sheep, to be honest, in order to make sure that it is as species rich as they possibly can be. And this provides a way of differentiating within the market for these livestock farmers to make money, make a profit, make a viable income from maintaining their species-rich grasslands. But the thing that's really interesting now is there's increasing recognition of the carbon potential and the carbon storage that grasslands have. A lot of this grassland land has been degraded and the soil carbon has decreased. And so by restoring a species-rich grassland, you can bring back the carbon into the soil and allow the land to heal. And we actually can see that the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere can be locked away into the soil and stored in the ground, which is why we consider it to be a climate solution. And as the video made clear, a third of all terrestrial carbon is stored in grassland soils, so that's a huge amount. And we know that species-rich grasslands actually store more carbon, significantly more carbon, than monoculture and species-poor soils, grassland soils do. So that's another reason why protecting and restoring our species-rich grassland is really critical in our fight against climate change. But as we all know, climate change doesn't just mean increasing temperatures and increasing CO2 levels. We have all of these other associated impacts of climate change and climate crisis. And one of them is the increase in extreme weather events. So whether that is drought or flooding, we're seeing these really intense periods where you either have no rain or you have too much of it. And that has impacts for food security and downstream communities oftentimes as well. And flood mitigation is one of the really valuable things that species-rich grassland can bring. So here you've got a photo, apologies if it's slightly faded out too much, of a floodplain meadow. And this is where the land and the grassland was able to absorb more water and store it, so that you actually didn't get this flood of water running downstream and creating some of the negative impacts for communities that we've seen in recent years. But actually the land had the ability to absorb and store it, reducing flow and allowing for that resilience for natural systems. So here you can see this kind of cross-section of what our landscapes have been. Some of these you can see are the monoculture rye, the luminous green ones tend to be monoculture ryegrass with a lot of fertilizer on top. Whereas some of these more complex species-rich grasslands create this sort of nice mosaic of different landscapes across particularly our hillsides, and particularly when you start to look at the uplands, you can't really do arable, you can't really do horticulture, and traditionally these species-rich grasslands and rough grazing would have been how they were managed, and we need to bring some of that back. So that's my presentation. I'm very happy to take questions and hear what you have to say. I can talk about COP26 and what the outcomes there were, what we're doing around UK government policy to try and protect them, or even what individuals and individual businesses can do. So I will stop sharing my screen and I will hand back to Mike, and hopefully you've got some questions.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Honor, for that. You talked about species-rich grasslands being so important for carbon sequestration, and that they hold much more carbon than improved grasslands. Can you give us a sense of the quantum on that? What sort of differentials are we talking about?
So it is statistically more, but I think what is really interesting to me is that this is a really emerging area of study. And so we really didn't look at soil carbon levels for a very long time in grasslands, because it was sort of perceived that, you know, you had your soil carbon at deep, deep, deep levels, but that kind of topsoil soil carbon didn't necessarily get measured in quite the same way and frequency. And so it's really been in the last sort of 15, 20 years that these grasslands have started to be recognised as being carbon stores. And so what we're seeing is that the science is very much emerging, and it really took off in Northern California. So here you have sort of prairies and rangeland across the United States, and particularly in California. There was a lot of research that was done there. But one of the things that is the problem with that is anyone who has spent any time in North America will know that the landscapes are really different. The climates are really different. The topography and the geology is really different. And so what we are encouraging at Plantlife is to make sure that when we are using data or gathering data, that we're trying to make it UK based. So it really reflects realities of grasslands in the UK, and that we don't conflate data from other countries, or particularly from North America, onto the UK context, because they are so different, and it is about understanding them within a landscape as opposed to being something generic. It's one of the points that we raise a lot in the discussion around methane and the impact that meat and dairy have. Oftentimes the data that's being used to make the argument that livestock is so detrimental comes from looking at high intensity, highly industrialized livestock systems, whether that's in Texas in a concentrated animal feedlot, or on deforested areas in Brazil where they're being fed on soy. And our point is you can't use that data and say that that impact is the same as a small herd of extensively grazed cattle in the UK, because the impacts are so different and the specifics are so different. And so as a result, we're really careful to say, well, actually, we need to have data that is based on a UK context and on a UK grasslands in order to have confidence in what they are saying. So that's something that Plantlife is working very closely with academics and universities across the UK to try and encourage more students to really look at this and to research what our UK data would be. But we know that it is considerably greater within species-rich grasslands and species-borne.
Okay, let's just pick up a couple of questions that have gone into the chat, and that can hopefully stimulate others. Helen Rook has put a couple of questions into the chat. She says, I'm trying to learn about my grasslands, identifying species, but I'm a novice. Many of us will be. What support and any funding is out there to help me create species-rich grasslands?
So I'd say that one of the best places to start is the Plantlife website, and I don't mean that to be a sales pitch, but it is quite good. And we launched, we hold National Meadows Day every July, first weekend of July, and for this year we launched an app called, which is the Great Wildflower Hunt, the Great British Wildflower Hunt. And with the app, you can help to identify the species within your grasslands and document them so that you can better understand how your grassland's functioning and what you have in there and what's growing, and monitor the changes year on year. But it also allows us to gather that citizen science, and so we can have a more informed knowledge about what is happening across the UK and where we're seeing species emerge or decline. So that's a really great resource. And there is also within that that aspect of our website a lot of information about how you can start to manage your grasslands better, what to do when, how to cut them, when to cut them. I think one of the real challenges is that the management of grasslands done well is quite nuanced, and it does require a bit of research and a bit of understanding. And we're very mindful of that, and we want to try and make that as easy as possible by giving people the guidance that they need, as both, local councils, as farmers, but also as individuals who just have a little patch of lawn or grassland in their backyard.
Okay. Thank you for that. And John Marshall, this is an interesting one, Honor, because we were having this discussion before we started today. John is saying, is there an increased risk of tree planting reducing grasslands? Exactly the conversation we had earlier. Or is it the huge numbers of closely planted trees that's the problem? Could trees and grasslands actually live together on wood pasture systems?
Yeah, and certainly they did. I think there's a real distinction within tree planting as to whether we're talking about forestry or whether we're talking about woodland creation. Those two things are pretty different. I think one is much more commercial, and one is about habitat restorations. But yes, there's a big problem. There's been a big push to have tree planting, and in some ways that's fantastic. We need to increase our tree canopy, we need to sequester carbon, but not at the detriment of our species-rich grasslands and some of the ancient grasslands that we have. And if you plant a whole load of trees all over them, you're going to destroy them. And so what our position is the right tree in the right place. So recognizing where we have potential for tree planting, where it will really help, and where adding trees into the system would be kind of key to delivering against our climate commitments, but also recognizing that species-rich grasslands and ancient grasslands have a huge role to play in carbon storage as well. And I think thus far, there maybe hasn't been enough recognition of the power of grasslands. And it's pretty easy from a communications tool to just say, oh, we've got a problem with carbon, we've got a problem with our climate, let's just plant a load of trees. And I think when you are facing a crisis, those really simple solutions can be very appealing. And if you are a politician who wants to have a nice headline about all the things that you're doing to help the planet, tree planting is a really great thing to do. You can have a photo of you out with a sapling and a spade, and that looks really good on your Twitter feed. But actually, it can really damage our ecosystems. And one of the things I think is critical is to broaden our climate conversation and not just talk about carbon. Obviously, carbon has a huge role to play, but we're also facing a biodiversity crisis. We're also facing a public health crisis and a societal crisis, and we need to address all of those things in the round. And if we just fixate purely on how many carbon tonnage.
I don't know whether Honor's frozen here. Has everybody else lost Honor at the moment? Yeah, you have. I can see some nodding here. Honor, we seem to have lost you for a moment, then you froze. So I wonder whether you could just run through what you were saying again for people's benefit.
Oh, how much got lost? Where do I start again?
The last minute or so.
Oh, okay. Well, it was genius. So it's a shame you all missed that. Brilliant point. No, what I was saying is that, you can start to look at woodland creation that also incorporates areas of species-rich grassland. You would have had sort of glades within woodlands, which had areas of open space that allowed different species to thrive. I'm sure some people remember walking through them. And that's what we want to see. We want to see this sort of mosaic of different ecosystems built up again, so that a variety of species can thrive and a variety of different habitats and ecosystems can exist in concert with each other, as opposed to this sort of slightly divisive narrative of, oh, let's just plant trees everywhere and that'll solve the problem.
Yeah. I know certainly from Yorkdale's perspective, I've had several farmers who've expressed concern that a neighbouring farm has been sold, or the land's been sold, and good quality pasture land is now being planted by a third party who doesn't even live locally, with trees. So that land is going to be lost for forever potentially. I wonder whether Anthony Bradley might be prepared to just turn on his microphone, because he's put a couple of quite interesting points in the chat, and I wonder, Anthony, whether you might just elaborate on that. You've talked about carbon audits for your land and how important that is, and even given some statistics on the measurement of those. I wonder whether you just got some comments that you could add.
Well, it's quite an interesting topic that I've been reading around for quite some time, to be fair. I was pretty confident that our soils had quite an amount of carbon, but when the results come back and they were up at 15% and not much lower than just under 10%. And we have in the past used lots of nitrogen. It's so bloody expensive now. I thought I'm going to use it at all next year. It's up at £600 a tonne. So you might get your wheat just by the market will fix that in some ways. But yeah, we're trying rotational grazing, and interesting the conversation about trees is we've been replanting on old hedge lines. And so we can do rotational grazing, not with electric fences, but we've sort of multiplied the number of fields we have by planting hedges. And so we can put a lot of stock on a small space for a brief amount of time and keep moving them. I'm not sure that's doing a lot for the total number of species, but I'm pretty sure it's good for cattle and sheep. Of course, any parasites there are on a particular field, they struggle to complete the life cycle because the livestock are not there very long, and it's a long time till they come back again. So there's health benefits with that. So in effect, we're mimicking what would have happened with the huge mobs of grazing cattle going back before man started farming, where they would be moved by packs of wolves or hyenas or lions or whatever it happened to be. Only we're doing it with walls and hedges and kind of approach. So I don't know whether it's the answer, but I think it might be part of the answer.
I would agree. I think mob grazing is a fantastic way of managing livestock. And I think it does have an impact on the soil health and, by extension, the biodiversity, both above and below the soil line. So it's something I'm really supportive of. I think that some of the sort of agroforestry systems where you have trees within a grazing area and hedgerows, as you said, hedgerows often used to have trees in them as well, and now we sort of think that they're just bushes. And I think that there's huge potential there, and I'm certainly very supportive of the mob grazing. It requires a lot of knowledge and planning in order to understand where your livestock are and how you're moving them around your holding. And I think it requires that you have done that research and you do understand what the impacts are, which I think is really fantastic if we're encouraging our farmers and land managers to develop that understanding of how their management practices interact with the environment and the wider systems and the wider landscapes. I think one thing to come back to that I just wanted to reference is, I think part of this is the support that farmers need to do this. It's fantastic that a lot of really innovative land managers are taking these steps on their own, but oftentimes people need to be encouraged and supported through with guidance, because it is complicated, as I said, but also financially. It's quite a big risk to make these transitions. and I don't know how Anthony feels, but certainly planting hedgerows and planting, even building fencing to allow some of these things can be really expensive and can really be out of reach of a lot of land managers and farmers who are existing on tighter and tighter margins. So we have to make sure that the government is really supporting this. And what you've seen recently is that there's been a lot of funds that have opened that will pay people to plant trees, and you can make money doing it. And one of the things that I'm really heartened to see is that there is now a commitment to develop a soil carbon code that would give funding to farmers who are improving or increasing their soil carbon levels through these different methods, whether it's mob grazing or it's minimum tillage or various other, reducing their nitrogen impact.
Anthony's just turned his microphone back on again, so I suspect he might want to respond to you on just the issue of cost.
The hedges we've planted, we've got them through a countryside stewardship scheme. So we've managed to make that work financially because my, one of them isn't a teenager now, but my teenage boys have been my very cheap hedge planters. Having zero cost, but if they wanted to lift a rugby or cricket, then they need to help me plant hedges. But if the hedge plants are the fencing wasn't paid for entirely by the stewardship, but when the hedge planting, the plants worked out at less than £2 a metre, but the payment for the planted hedge was £11.60 a metre. So the fact that my family gang planted the plants ourselves, there was, yes, obviously a cost in terms of time, but there wasn't a cost in terms of cash. And it more than offset the extra I'd spent on the fences that the stewardship scheme didn't cover. I confess that if that hadn't been the case, I would have been much more reluctant to have gone down that route. It might have been a case of buying an electric fence. Because once you've got the posts and the wire and the energizer, you can put it wherever you like, whenever you like. There's a faff, and I'm somewhat allergic to electric fences. Back in the days when we milked cows, we used them a lot, and they're just a bloody pain. But and sheep don't respect them either. So if you've got sheep, electric fences are about useless, really. So there was a chance to do the right thing in inverted commas with planting hedges and things, but I wanted to co-opt all my stewardship scheme work into helping me farm. That was the angle I came from it. Some of people may have heard of the Pomp Rent project, and they did a similar thing that I was quite attracted to. I'm not saying mine's exactly like theirs, but the principle of reinstating old hedges and things like that was seemed to me an idea that would work, especially because they help with things like runoff when it rains a lot, which was, we're getting more, not so much more rain, but more intense periods of rain, and infiltration of water when it comes to a hedge can be 60 or 70 times faster than a field of grass. So planting my hedges is, in a sense, as well, as also started to future-proof us for climate change, I hope. But
excellent. Anthony, I don't know whether you'd be willing, but I know a couple of farmers who are very interested in what you're talking about, whether you'd be prepared to private message me in the chat with your contact details.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
That would be helpful, so I can just connect people. It's wonderful. If I can maybe just pick up a comment from Kath, and maybe in a moment Kath can talk to us about this, but I was very interested in what she's mentioning, Honor, which is about fungi, and we are increasingly realizing the importance of fungi in soils from the point of view of carbon sequestration and just health as well, and indeed public health and medicine. So I wonder whether, Kath, you might just care to comment on your findings around Calderdale. You might need to turn your microphone on. Yeah.
There.
That's it.
I'm not an expert one of my colleagues from Halifax Scientific Society, of which I'm a member. I don't even live in Halifax. I live just south of Leeds, but they have this wonderful society which is now more focused on nature and wildlife than science as a whole. But one of our members is employed to study the grasslands in the particularly in the upper Calderdale Valley, and because I think it's long been known that the area around Halifax has quite a wealth of fungi, and we went on a walk on Sunday, and some of these are little tiny, but they're not edible. They're just tiny fungi, and I don't, as I say, I'm not an expert. I don't even know whether technically wax caps are classed as fungi. They might not be. One of my colleagues, Philip, is also on the call, so he might be able to say a bit more than me. But these are grassland species, and if you have mass tree planting, somebody else said that earlier, a bit ago, you get farming land being sold, and a third party will come in and plant trees because there is a grant towards it, and you lose these species, which are quite rare. We don't know how rare they are, because we've only really just discovered, I think wax caps have only really been technically discovered in the last, I don't know, 15, 20 years or something like that. So we need to know what we're doing, and that's the role of our colleague Steve, who's surveying these areas, going around farmland in the upper Calderdale area, just looking to see what there is. And just as an example, there's I don't know whether I'll be able to share it on here or not, but I took a picture on Sunday of a fungus called, or a wax cap. I don't even know what it is. I'm not an expert, as I say, but it's called violet coral, and it looks like a sea coral, but it is bright purple, and it's beautiful. It's about the size of my hand, and in fact there were about 3 or 4 in the field that I looked at, and one of them had already been stood on by somebody who didn't see it, and thought it was was obviously looking in the distance or looking for molehills or cowpats. So I think we've also got to look at grasslands and tree planting as a whole in this country. There's this almost myth that the whole of the country was planted with trees up until about the 16th century or the Industrial Revolution, and it looks like it wasn't. I think we started clearing trees from grassland as far back as the as the Stone Age, the late Stone Age. So it's been said that we have this safari-like, or not, maybe not. No, safari is the wrong word. But we've long had grasslands in this country, and yes, we have lost a lot of woodland, but we need to be careful where we replace it, and also with what species as well. And if you just throw money at it and people see it as an investment opportunity, then you're either throwing out the baby with the bathwater. You just don't know what you're getting. There needs to be a lot more thought going into this.
So can I just push that question across to you, Honor? Fungi and species-rich grasslands, do the two go together?
They do, absolutely. So we are doing our wax cap survey at the moment. So just like I said, we have the wildflower app. We've got a wax cap app that will help people to identify wax caps that they find in their immediate area and register them, understand them a bit better as to how they function, what they do, and also more importantly, really for us, is to know where they are. Because they are disappearing, and we are really at risk of losing this incredible kingdom that we have in our fungi. But one of the things that is interesting is, I've mentioned frequently, or at least a few times, the idea of ancient meadows. And with an ancient woodland, there is a definition in law. If in the survey of 1850, there were trees, that woodland was identified, then that still qualifies it as an ancient woodland. You can't find such a simple statement for what an ancient meadow is. A lot were ploughed up in the Second World War to grow food. A lot have had nitrogen applications. That doesn't make them no longer ancient meadows, because a lot of them can be restored and brought back. And so one of the things that we have been sort of toying with recently is the idea that if you have a wax cap on that grassland, that is an indicator that it is an ancient grassland and should be protected. So one of the big pushes that we're going to be looking at for next year is whether we can get increased protection in law for grasslands that have wax caps in them, in recognition that they've got this incredible network under the soil of fungi, that they have a carbon storage potential that really needs to be valued, and that they need increased protection the same way that you would protect an ancient woodland.
Excellent, thank you. Maybe if she's prepared to contribute, it'd be nice to bring in Flora Sharp. Flora's put a couple of comments in the chat. Firstly, saying how helpful the Wildlife Trust has been in Devon. But she's also commented on her own farm. So Flora, I don't know whether you're prepared to just put your microphone on and tell us a little bit about that, and particularly feeding your livestock on species-rich grassland.
Yeah, hi, it's not Flora.
Oh, it's not Flora.
It's Murray Sharp, her father. She's a tech-savvy one, so it's her name on there, I'm afraid.
Excellent. I know the feeling.
Yeah, sorry. I mean, my whole farm is really wood pasture and unimproved grasslands, and partly recovering improved grasslands as well. So we don't use any fertilizers. We haven't done for, well, I've only been farming it for 6 years, but I managed it previously to that. So it hasn't had fertilizer for sort of, or the improved areas haven't had fertilizer for near on 20 years. But we have meadows full of wax caps, lots of acidic grasslands, lots of marshy grasslands. We use native breed Devon cattle on those grasslands. And there are issues. We're not mob grazing at the moment. Many of our fields are quite isolated from the farm. So although we're on a big estate, they're spread around. It's a 300-acre farm, but it's not in one block. So it's quite difficult to carry out a mob system. So we're sort of very extensive grazing. So we have about 0.3 of a livestock unit that's grazing across our farm. So it's pretty low levels. And we just about make that work. It's quite tricky to actually produce. So it's a part-time farm, so I should say that. Mm. So the livestock just about now cover the rent, just about. Mm. So, but it's a fascinating subject and it's really interesting. So we're working with Devon Wildlife Trust at the moment to try and enrich some of our old grasslands, some of our sort of semi-improved grasslands. So we're putting in yellow rattle, trying to weaken various plants and encourage more wildflowers.
I think it's, so I was just going to say, I think it's one of those really interesting questions, and one particularly when I'm speaking to land managers and farmers that I always want to make the point of, which is, you know, we need to be more sustainable, absolutely, but that sustainability also has to be economically sustainable, because we've got to make these systems viable for farmers to do, because, you know, people don't, I would love that more people did it because they knew it was the right thing to do and that they wanted to make a difference, but people need to make a living, people need to cover the rent. This needs to be incentivized so people can actually make a living from these systems, and that it makes economic sense. And I don't think we've quite got there yet. I think it's a big role for government to play, a big role for retailers to play, in how do you make these systems.
I think that's one of the biggest worries for us is that you know, the changes in the grant scheme will seriously affect how the farm runs. I mean, obviously the landlord knows what grants we get, so the rent is set accordingly. But what we're hoping is that there will be acknowledgement that rents will have to come down substantially if they want these extensive systems to work. I came to farming from nature conservation grazing, so I have a sort of slightly different ethic. I'm not totally about food production. I'm much more about wildlife management, but it is really hard to make it work. So fingers crossed, things like wax caps will be taken into account in the new sort of elm system, and carbon storage, and all these things hopefully will build a package that actually will make it sustainable, because it's one of the big things that worries us if the basic payment scheme goes as well, which it is.
Go.
I'm not quite sure how we will survive that. So we're obviously trying to diversify now, but it seems almost we're doing the right things and have been doing the right things for a long time, but actually we might be lost in the whole grand scheme of the new grant schemes.
I think it is. I mean, the grant scheme is something that I've been working on for a long time now. I think that there's a real risk. I think what will happen is that there's this massive shake-up is going to be in BPS goes, and that they are funding environmental goods, essentially ecosystem services. I genuinely believe that it will be possible for an area of land or a holding to claw its way back to the same level of funding that it currently gets within BPS and under CAP. But it's going to take a very different approach. It's going to take a really engaged land manager going out and understanding where the schemes are, what they need to do. It's going to be a blend of private financing from water companies who want to reduce the nitrates that are getting into the table water and will pay farmers to do it. It's going to be looking at hedgerows and carbon from trees, and it's also going to be looking at what the government comes up with. ELM, the environmental land management scheme that the government's proposing, has 3 different categories within it. The sustainable farming incentive, which will have a sort of menu of options that different farmers and land managers will be able to pick from in order to get support for. But I think there's a really big question within that is, if you've already been doing the right thing for 20 years, how do they reward you for that?
Right.
If you're switching over from being a high input, highly polluting food producer, there's going to be lots of money available to you. If you've been doing the right thing for a long time, they need to make sure that they're supporting that with maintenance payments, as well as incentivizing people to switch practices. But that said, when you look at the other 2 pillars of ELM, which are the local nature recovery and the landscape recovery schemes, they are much more focused around how do we bring these farmers together to achieve, and land managers more broadly, achieve a difference across this landscape. How do we, let's identify what our kind of key issues are within this specific area, whether that's, flood mitigation, or whether that's air quality, or whether that's biodiversity loss. And let's work together collectively to try and improve those things. And that's where I see the kind of combination of all of those things coming together. But that's really complicated and difficult and challenging. How a farmer is meant to find time to do all of that research in between trying to make a profitable business and get the cattle out in the morning and get them all to the dairy, I don't know. And the government's not making it much easier to find out, because they're slightly behind the curve.
It's tricky stuff. Just while I've got the 2 of you on, for perhaps anyone on this call who's thinking about trying to improve the quality of their species richness in their meadows, and they want to make a start, and you've mentioned putting yellow rattle in to try and reduce the competitiveness of the grass. Any pointers for people? What are the sort of steps that people could take to start to build the species richness of their pasture land? Any thoughts?
So it is very complicated and it is really challenging, and that's why Plantlife has a team of grasslands experts and restoration experts that are always at the end of the phone. So if you do have questions, you can always just call them up and they will answer. But we also do have quite a nice, one of the kind of key questions is around seeding. You know, do you just throw down a whole bunch of wildflower seeds that you bought online, or is that actually not going to create the biodiversity that we need, because it's not specific to your location, and oftentimes they're not native varieties. So we've created a really nice sort of flow chart that kind of guides you through the options of what might be best, and where you can get sort of green donor hay from other species-rich grasslands within your immediate vicinity. So you can try and find more natural ways of creating that seedbed. Yeah.
And any thoughts? Sorry, I didn't catch your Christian name. All I'd got was the flora.
That'll do. It's Murray.
Murray. Have you got any advice on this?
Yeah, well, I mean, we've been much as before. We've been working with Devon Wildlife Trust, so they've identified local donor sites, which quite a few of them are on my farm, and so they've been doing the seed collection and then giving us back some of the seed. Right. So the key thing that they seem to be looking for is reducing competition in the grasslands. So we're grazing it off quite hard the year before we want to reseed, and making sure that there is a tiny bit. I don't want to. It sounds like there's a tiny bit of bare soil in the sward. So if you were looking into the sward, you can just see a little bit of earth in there. And then we're using that. Then we're spreading the yellow rattle seed, or we've got knapweed and all sorts of things in there as well. But from this donor site, and then just again lightly grazing it to sort of trample it in a little bit, and then the sheep come out, and the results can be spectacular in the spring. With yellow rattle, certainly can be amazing, the recovery of it. So that's how we've been doing it, and we've been, as I say, we've been working with Devon Wildlife Trust to do that. Excellent.
And it is a tricky thing. We've got a lady who works with the Tea Swale project up here, who is a farmer in Cumbria, but she's also the sponsor for wildflowers. She's been trying to sow yellow rattle in her fields now for 5 years and had dismal failure every year. And she's a specialist in this area, so it just goes to prove that it is tricky. It's not a straightforward thing. But there is help out there, and I think, Honor, you're saying that if people start with the Plantlife website, that will give them a little flowchart of where to go. Devon Wildlife Trust, and indeed in other parts of the country, there are a number of organisations you can plug into. And if you want any advice or help, you don't get it on this call, then by all means, feel free to email me, and I will try and connect people so that they can get the support and the resources that they need. If perhaps I could just pick up a couple more questions. We've got John Marshall asking a very practical question about how do you measure carbon storage?
Soil carbon testing. It is getting cheaper to do. Back to Northern California, in a nice sort of confluence of academic expertise, you're actually getting Silicon Valley developing some really low-cost sensors that can monitor soil carbon a lot more efficiently and cheaply. And my hope is that will be much more readily available in the coming years, and that the cost will decline, because actually it's almost prohibitive at the moment, and it means that farmers and land managers don't have that level of detail and knowledge, and we don't have those data points to use. There are a number of other proxies that we can use and do use around soil carbon and soil health. So one of them's earthworm counts. That can be a really good indicator of how healthy your soil is. But my hope is that with the technological developments that are happening and the resources that are being put into it, we'll get more easily accessible soil carbon testing.
And there's the Farm Carbon Toolkit program that's being rolled out at the moment. There's quite a lot of funding available for farm carbon toolkits. And again, if anybody needs a contact for that, then feel free to drop me an email, and I'll give them details for that. John Hoban has asked, can you suggest food certification labels that you can look for when buying meat and dairy on pasture-fed or species-rich grass-fed foods?
Yeah, the Pasture for Life certification is probably the best one specifically on that. They tend to work with quite smallholder livestock producers, so it's not as easily accessible. You're not going to find it in Tesco's, but it really is the kind of gold standard for pasture-based grassland systems in the UK. Buying organic is never going to be a bad choice in the more mainstream retail, but obviously there's a cost associated with that, and you know that creates some challenges for low-income communities and individuals who want to make the right choice. So I think it's about looking at it more broadly and seeing what it is that we can do to make this raising the baseline so that all of our food in the UK is produced to this sort of environmental standard that we really expect. But have a look at the Pasture for Life certification, because they're pretty great.
Okay. Perhaps I can just open this to anybody else on the call. If you've got questions that you've not asked yet, perhaps you could give me a wave or put a hand up. If you go to the reactions bit at the bottom of your screen, you'll find that you're able to put your hand up, and I can come to you to take a question from you if you've got a question. So anybody got anything that they wanted to pose as a question to Honor? Sue, we've got Sue Stokes. Let's go to Sue. If you can turn your microphone on, Sue.
Hi, I'll just get myself organised there. Or
that's it. We saw you for a moment. That's it.
Yes, I just wanted to say about the support for small holdings, where obviously it doesn't qualify for the larger farming aspects or any of the forestry aspects of the improving the environment. But I do think the links that you've given to your Plantlife website and that tip about grazing off hard the year before planting to try and get even yellow rattle or other flower meadows started. Are you encouraging the smallholding owners to, for those that have probably got it more as of a lifestyle change, to encourage them to plant as many flower meadows as possible as well? Is that part of your tactic?
Certainly. I think you're correct that there's a real challenge here in that the farm subsidies have not been accessible to smallholders in the past. There is a big campaign run by the Land Workers Alliance to push for a reduction in the threshold so that more farmers and smallholders would be eligible. But yes, so I work on the agriculture policy team. So obviously my focus is around agriculture and farming and how particularly the environmental land management scheme can be designed to do this. But my colleagues at Plantlife work across the board on encouraging everybody to look at increasing their species niche grasslands, from individuals who have an area of lawn in their garden through to local councils. And one of the things that we're really pushing for is actually one of the largest areas of grassland in the UK are our road verge systems. So our verges along our highways and our streets are actually one of our biggest opportunities for grassland restoration. And so my colleagues at Plantlife have been running a campaign engaging with local authorities, local councils, to try and talk to them about managing their land better for species richness, whether that's areas of parkland or marginal land within housing developments, but also working with Highways England to try and look at how we can use those road verges to be more biodiverse and more species rich. So everywhere, we'll talk to anyone about this. We're always keen for a chat. Anyone who's interested, we'll try and support them to increase their species richness.
Fantastic, thank you.
Excellent. Anybody else got any other questions that they'd like to pose? Feel free, don't be bashful. Can I maybe come to Kath? I don't know whether you're trying to eat something at the moment. If you can turn your microphone on. You've dropped a comment into the chat, which I thought was probably easier if you explained.
Yeah, there's a farmer based up in Cumbria called, I think it's James Reedbanks, and he read his, he's written a couple of books, but it's I suppose, a memoirs you'd call them, and he read it on Radio 4 a few months ago. But he made a comment about you get farms that are exclusively arable and farms that are exclusively crop growing, and there's no, you get waste on both sides. You get livestock farms that produce loads of slurry, which they have to dispose of somehow because they don't need to put them on the fields, and yet you get crop growing farms which then need to put artificial fertilizers on, and mixed farming seems to have just disappeared. I'm not a farmer, maybe somebody like Murray or somebody else could enlighten me as why there's been a trend away from mixed farming in the last few years, and is it funding, and how can you get that? Because that would seem, it might, I don't know, I mean, maybe Honor can answer that, but would that go part way to solving the problem of reducing over, you know, the high protein, high nitrogen content in grassland and the low carbon storage capacity? Would that be part of an answer to have to go back to mixed farming, and how do you support it? How do you encourage it?
Well, I'm very happy for anybody else to give an answer as well. I'll just give my reflections sort of quickly, which is, I think, yes, we absolutely need to encourage more mixed farming and rotational management of our systems. My thoughts on why it declined is much more broadly looking at the economics of our food system, where you had consolidation. So farmers are encouraged through the contracts that they were in to just produce one good and sell it on that one contract into large-scale retailers. It was too complicated to produce lots of different products in smaller amounts. And those contractors, those retailers wanted to purchase, large amounts of one good. And so it pushed people into specialization. It pushed people into being purely a dairy farmer or purely a livestock, purely horticulture. And, even within horticulture, you see people only producing brassicas or only producing potatoes, because that's the market mechanism that best works when you have this sort of longer supply chains, highly consolidated retail sectors. And I think that is something that we need to look at. Our farmers react to the wider dynamics of our food system and the wider dynamics of our economics, and how do we ensure that we use retail and the power of the purse and consumer demand to try and tackle some of these, the consolidation and almost exclusive production of one good, which doesn't actually do very much for diversifying farm livelihoods and makes people very dependent on the price that they can get for one product, which I'm sure any dairy farmers on this will know that purely producing milk and being dependent on the price for milk can be a very volatile and risky place to be.
Yeah, the irony of it is it shackled a lot of people into a relationship that they'd not been able to get out of, where their margins have been eroded progressively. Anthony's dropped a comment into the chat, but he's also put his hand up to come back talk about, I think, the question that Kath asked. So Anthony, if you could turn your microphone on, then yep, there you go. Okay.
I forgot what I was going to comment on now. It was James Rebanks talking about, I think, wasn't it, talking about a surplus of nutrients on livestock farms and an absence of them on arable farms. There was a time, and despite my youthful good looks, I'm fairly long in the tooth now, but as a young man, I can remember lots and lots of sheep, and to a lesser extent cattle, went east in winter. They were sent away for wintering, and I suspect that was almost the death knell of mixed farming. But if anybody wants to know why farmers have specialised, you can do worse than read Tescopoly by Andrew Sims, and it describes very eloquently how what have we got, 4, 5, 6 supermarket chains who have got a hold of the market in a vice-like grip round their short and curlies, if I'm also sufficiently long enough in the tooth to remember when breweries were forced by, I believe, a Thatcher government to sell off their tied houses because it was abuse of market power. We seem to have a blind spot about supermarkets, and it's a function of a post-war drive for ever cheaper food, because and we are, I suspect, we're reaping what we've sowed. If you have an economic system that drives food production to the lowest cost model, don't be surprised with the outcome. It isn't all about economics, I'll grant you, but it's I wouldn't say it keeps me awake at nights, but it's one of those things that there will not be a single farmer in the country who doesn't wrestle with that. Even those who are direct selling will have to have cognizance of a least cost food system, and rather bigger subject than just this chat.
Yeah. What a lovely comment to round up on there, I think.
I'm not pessimistic, because my dad used to say, food will never go out of fashion.
Excellent. Well, look, we're 12:15. We've been going for an hour and a quarter. I very much appreciate the contributions that people have made to this discussion. It's made it much more lively as a consequence of having your participation. So thank you very much for that, and thank you, Honor, for setting the scene with your presentation for that discussion. Just a final question, I guess, for you to end on with this is, how can people get involved in supporting the Plantlife Grasslands campaign, if they're motivated by this presentation to do so?
So, as I said, we launched the Grasslands Plus campaign last summer. That's still going, and that's very much focused on how grasslands are a climate solution. But then also in the run-up to National Meadows Day in July, we're going to be running a series of activities and engagements to try and bring more awareness onto species-rich meadows. But have a look at the website. There's a lot of really interesting content on there. As I said, we talk about grasslands in so many different ways, recognising the complexity of those systems. So there's a lot to learn there. And if anyone's got any questions or just have some thoughts, I'm always really happy to help, and I'm happy to answer anything or redirect people to the right person who has the expertise to answer them.
Excellent. So for people on this call, if they've got any supplementary questions they might like to ask, are you happy that I send out just a note with your email contact? Yeah, that's smashing. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you very much. We'll do a bit of editing